Good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to our final Brown Deck series of the fall. The next time you see us, we'll be doing something more exciting and better and bigger. But we appreciate all of you coming, and we certainly appreciate First Bank of Alabama, the wonderful support that they give us for this. So go by and make a deposit or borrow $10, whatever makes them feel good. Of course, if not, Chris will help you out when you go out the door. Don't worry about it. There's something about having Dolores Hydock with you that makes you think that you're just a little bit better than most people. You think that you're very lucky. And the beautiful thing about her is that for days after hearing her, seeing her, and talking with her, I feel good all over. And, that's just a wonderful feeling. And isn't that wonderful that we can have someone this talented? We know from Reading, Pennsylvania, we know that she can do cornbread. We know that she smuggled cigarettes into Poland or West Germany or East Germany or wherever she happened to be. But she's magic. And without taking any more time, but certainly welcome all of you here, get ready for the absolute best storyteller on the face of the earth, Dolores Hydock.
Dr. Ted is just dangerous. They let him come up here and make these announcements, but time after time, he comes up with things. You wonder where he comes up with cigarettes in East Germany. I'm going to have to talk to him after that. Thank you for being here today. Coming out in the snow. I mean, it's just amazing that you're here. This past weekend, of course, this beautiful Marble City was host to the fall pilgrimage of the Alabama Historical Association. And I just want to say congratulations to Dr. Ted and Dr. Shirley and Tracy and Mike and Kreger and all the library people who were associated with that. Wasn't it a fabulous weekend? Let's give them a big round of applause. It was a beautiful showcase of this beautiful city, and it was just amazing to just be able. I was just here for a tiny part of it on Friday evening. The fact that the fall pilgrimage was just here, and the fact that this fall series was called Sentimental Journey, that was the theme for the fall series. It seemed appropriate to close out this series today with some stories that I'm calling pilgrimages to sacred places. Pilgrimages, of course, kind of imply that the place you're going is someplace that holds a special memory or a special meaning, a place that you want to see at least once or a place that you want to see over and over again. And somebody asked me one time, well, what's the difference between a pilgrimage and just get in your car and going someplace? I mean, you don't usually make a pilgrimage to Walmart, And I thought about it, and I thought, well, one of the differences is that in a pilgrimage, the journey is almost as important as the destination. And the journey itself changes you in a way, as well as when you finally reach the place that you're going to. I also want to say, because it's a sentimental journey, I do want to warn you, you have your tissues. I'm afraid the sentimental journey has got a little sentimental, and so I'm just giving you a little heads up there. I have my tissues ready. But it's my hope, as it always is, that these stories about some pilgrimages, some sentimental journeys to places that were special, even sacred to me, might have you leaving here thinking about and remembering some pilgrimages, some journeys that you've made to places that are special to you. Well, a few years ago, this was pre-COVID, it was about 2018, I was one of 4 storytellers at the Azalea Storytelling Festival in LaGrange, Georgia. Any of you ever been to LaGrange, Georgia? Beautiful town. The first weekend in March is when they always have that festival. First weekend in March is a great time to be in LaGrange, Georgia. And while I was there that year, I told my story, Dr. Ted referred to it, my story about being a Pennsylvania Yankee wanting to learn to make real Southern cornbread. Some of you have heard that story. And if you haven't, just part of the story tells about how I grew up, as Dr. Ted said, in Reading, Pennsylvania. Some of you have heard me talk about Reading before. where, like most of those northeastern industrial cities, the city had kind of evolved into a patchwork of ethnic neighborhoods. There was the Greek neighborhood, the Polish neighborhood, the Irish, the Italian, Pennsylvania Dutch. Because most of the families that I knew, everybody, all the kids I went to school with, neighbors, most of us were just a couple of generations away from Ellis Island. And so all the moms that I knew, all the moms of all my friends, cooked ethnic food. You know, if I was invited to Karen Antonelli's house for supper, there'd be chicken cacciatore. If it was the Hammerschmidts, it would be sauerbraten. Now, Monica Shannon's mom made incredible Irish stew. And at our house, despite the Betty Crocker cookbook that she had for 32 years, despite the pantry shelf lined with little cardboard boxes full of mixes for strawberry jello and butterscotch pudding and lemon whip and chill, most of what my mother cooked was Polish. Stuffed cabbage rolls, garlicky sausage, slow-cooked sauerkraut, gołąbki, kielbasa, kapusta. And so that's the food I grew up on. And when I moved to Alabama right out of college, boy, I had to learn a lot of things. I mean, I had to learn to say yes, ma'am. I had to learn the difference between y'all and all y'all. I had to learn that essential Alabama phrase. They had good field position, but they failed to execute. But mostly I had to learn about really, really different food. Black-eyed peas, turnip greens, congealed salads, Mississippi mud cake, neon green pepper jelly quivering on top of a block of cream cheese with Ritz crackers. Amazing new taste, but one of the most amazing new tastes to me was the cornbread. I had never had cornbread before I moved to Alabama. Bless my heart, right? And so the story goes on to tell about why I now have 18 pieces of cast iron cookware in my collection. So anyway, I told that story, and when I finished, we took a break for lunch, and this man from the audience came up to me, this very nice man, and he told me that if I was homesick for Polish cooking, I needed to know about the annual pierogi festival in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Any of you heard of this festival? Lawrenceville, Georgia, about 45 minutes on the other side of Atlanta. He told me about it. I got home, looked it up. Of course, I couldn't believe this. There is a Polish church in Lawrenceville, Georgia, that every year has a pierogi festival. It is a celebration of Polish food and music and culture. And now that I knew about it, of course, I had to go. So that last Saturday in August of that year, I drove 3.5 hours to Lawrenceville, Georgia, for a blissful trip back to the old country. There was live Polish music, lots of accordion and clarinet. There were people dancing polkas in the blazing hot Georgia sun out there on the church lawn. They had a raffle. One of the main prizes was a giant bottle of Polish buffalo grass vodka, which, if you've never had it, is a revelation. They had T-shirts. I got this one. It says, Kocham Polska, I love Poland. And of course, there was food. Stuffed cabbage rolls, garlicky sausage, slow-cooked sauerkraut, jelly donuts, gołąbki, kielbasa, kapusta, pączki, and pierogi. Now, many of you may not know, any of you know about pierogi? A few of you, you've seen Mrs. T's in the frozen down. Okay. Why would you know about it? Pierogi, it is a kind of a plain dough, like a pasta dough, rolled into a circle. And then it's folded over some, and by the way, there is a singular form of the word, but why? You never eat one, you know. But you fold the pasta over some kind of filling, and the filling can be sweet. It could be like a blueberry compote or baked apples, but the ones my grandmother always made from scratch, the ones she made were savory. Mushrooms and sauerkraut filling, farmer's cheese, which is like a very dry kind of cottage cheese, mashed potatoes. And if the idea of mashed potatoes wrapped in dough seems a little hefty, just remember that Polish DNA comes with the chromosome that guarantees an almost limitless capacity for carbohydrates. So you fold the dough over the filling, you crimp the edges with a fork. It looks like a little fried pie, but you don't fry it. You boil it like a dumpling, and then to finish it off, you saute it in onions and lots and lots and lots and more butter. As another T-shirt said, life is too short not to be Polish. Well, one plateful of those mushroom sauerkraut, two platefuls of the mushroom sauerkraut pierogi transported me to my grandmother's kitchen. And I could see her there in that kitchen, hand making those pierogi, her long silver white hair pulled into a bun at the back of her neck, her checkered apron over her house dress, standing there, her face flushed from the heat of the stove, her apron dusted with flour. And I thought about her and her homemade pierogi that whole afternoon. I thought about her on the whole 3.5-hour drive back to my house in Pennsylvania, in Birmingham. And as soon as I get back home, I went to the top shelf of the bookcase in the living room to get this. It's a little gardening spade. My grandmother was famous for her green thumb. She always had the prettiest garden in the neighborhood, and this is the one souvenir I have of her. I got it when, 27 years ago, when I first moved into the house I live in now in Irondale. My Pennsylvania mother, came to visit me. And we sat there on the back porch, and she looked out at the almost half acre of muscadine vines, wisteria vines, blueberry bushes, 10-foot-tall gardenia bushes, brassy orange daylilies popping up everywhere. And knowing that I had spent my entire adult life living in apartments and condominiums with nothing more complicated to care for than some silk chiffaleras from Hobby Lobby, she looked at all that vegetation and said, well, maybe you've inherited your grandmother's green thumb. And then she looked at me and said, I hope so. You're going to need it. And when she got back home, she mailed me this. I don't use it for gardening. I use it for inspiration. Because when I look at this little gardening spade, I can see my grandmother, not in her kitchen, but standing out in her garden, bending over her roses, exhorting them to new heights of botanical beauty. Kopaj głęboko, sięgaj do światła, połóż nowe korzenie, dojrzewaj. Dig down deep, lean into the light, put down new roots, and grow. My grandmother was the daughter of a family that came to this country from southern Poland through Ellis Island at the very last part of the 1890s. And she ended up marrying a man, my grandfather, who made that exact same trip in 1912. And so all my life, I'd heard about Ellis Island. I'd heard about the resilient, the resourceful people who had come through there. And it made me curious, of course, to see it for myself. And finally, the last week of December of 1999, I went to Ellis Island, 87 years after my grandfather did. Like him, like everybody, really, I got there by boat. In my case, it was a ferry boat that was crowded and noisy with the chatter of the members of a tour group from Kyoto, Japan. Those tour group members had lots of camera equipment, lots of curiosity, but you could tell they had no particular personal family connection to that place. They might have had a personal family connection to another port of entry, maybe on the West Coast, but not Ellis Island. You could tell those of us who did have a personal family connection to that place. The tour group members were all clustered at the back of the ferry boat, snapping digital photographs of Battery Park and the skyscrapers of the financial district. We were at the front of the boat, staring out across choppy gray water, eager as they must have been for our first glimpse of the island. The tour group members all laughed and talked. We were silent, listening for the whispers of ghosts who knew our names, who gave us our names. The main building there in Ellis Island was chilly that Sunday morning when we got there. We were the first ferry boat load of tourists to come through after it had all been closed for several days for the Christmas holiday. And so the steam heat hadn't begun to fill that huge space, 3 stories high, that would have reverberated with a babble of languages back at the turn of the 20th century. 10,000 people a day in the peak immigration years, all of them speaking different languages, different dialects. It would have been so noisy then, but it was so quiet that Sunday morning. Just the echo of our footsteps, of their footsteps. The registry hall there in the main building has been beautifully restored. Have any of you been to Ellis Island since the big restoration project of the 90s? Oh, it's been restored so that it looked that Sunday morning pretty much the way it would have looked to my grandfather in 1912. The long wooden benches in that registry hall are not reproductions. They're the same benches, worn smooth by rough cloth and tired bodies. I sat on one of those long wooden benches, not a reproduction, same benches. I thought, right here. My grandfather might have sat right here. At one end of the registry hall, there were podium-style desks, tall desks that would have held ship's rosters, large books that were open to reveal long lists of strange names scrawled in black ink, names like Minicucci, Wierzbicki, Antonelli, Abramowitz, names that were called out one by one, 10,000 people a day, and they called the names out one by one. There's the story of the Italian woman sitting on one of those long wooden benches, suddenly looks up, turns to her 12-year-old daughter, says, "How does that man know my name?" At the other end of the registry hall, there's a steep staircase leading from the front door up to the registry hall. That was their first test. Most of them didn't know it. But anyone who limped or wheezed or stumbled coming up those steep steps was pulled aside for extra medical examination, their clothing marked with a chalk letter to indicate what might be wrong with them: L for legs, E for eyes, H for heart. The registry hall has a balcony above it, rings it like a halo. The balcony is lined with little rooms that now are display rooms to show how those rooms were once used. There's the medical examining room where a doctor would use a hairpin or a shoe button hook to turn back the eyelids of the immigrants to check for trachoma, a horribly contagious infection of the eye. It could cause blindness, even death. Some people said that was the most terrifying part of the whole terrifying Ellis Island experience, walking into a little room and having a man in a white coat speaking a language you didn't understand come up to put a sharp metal object in your eye. There were rooms where they had to take an arithmetic quiz, had to count backwards from 20, had to match up geometric shapes to prove they had wits enough to survive in this new country. There were rooms that had displays of the clothing they wore, the money they carried, the food they ate. There's the story of the Armenian family that had to spend the night. An immigrant aid society gave them a little box lunch to tide them over. They weren't sure they were going to like this weird American food. It was rubbery, chewy, a strange color. They'd never seen a banana before, didn't know you were supposed to peel it first. Another room had a display of newspapers published in foreign languages by those immigrant aid societies. Most of the articles for the men were about finding work. The articles for the women were about fashion and food. The women were told, for instance, to get rid of that long hair that they all wore in braids and buns. The modern style was a short, blunt bob. There's the story of the Czechoslovakian girl, 14 years old, came to this country by herself, got through Ellis Island, met up with relatives, moved into the Lower East Side. The whole time, 14 years old, so brave, never shed a tear. Until the day that she went to the barber and asked him to cut off her waist-length brown hair. Then she cried. Another article told the women to stop wearing those big, full, ankle-length skirts. The modern American style was sleek and straight, but these were not women with sleek, straight bodies. These were women with hips. with bodies designed to survive long winters on a diet of potatoes and cabbage. There's the story of the Russian woman who made herself a long, straight, sleek dress and wore it with her big, full ankle-length skirt on top of it. I went into all those rooms. I looked at all those displays. The spirit I was searching for was the spirit of my grandfather, who came through there in 1912 when he was 17 years old. His mother did not want her only son drafted into the Russian army, the fate of most Polish boys in 1912. And so the family and friends and neighbors scraped together enough money to buy him a ticket on a steamship passage so that he can get himself to Rochester, New York, where there was a relative. They figured if he was old enough for the Tsar to want him, he was old enough to get himself to Rochester. And he did. And he found the relative who hooked him up with two other fellows from that same little village in Poland. And the three young men made their way to Reading, Pennsylvania, a railroad and mill town where they heard there was work. My grandfather made some friends, got a job, met my green-thumbed grandmother, started a family. He always meant to go back to Poland, but he never got there. He lived to be 94 years old, and he never got back. My grandfather was a serious man with a thick shock of silver hair and deep brown eyes. He loved poetry and classical music and literature. And so, of course, the woman he married was my green-thumbed grandmother, who liked to sing and dance and have a good time. Her name was Teofila. It's a beautiful old-fashioned name. It means daughter of God, Teofila. You don't hear it anymore. But her friends called her Fila. Fila was sunny and fun. I have a picture of my grandmother as a young woman, maybe early 20s. She's with three other young women. They're outside in a park on a beautiful day. They have round, smiling faces. Their long brown hair is in braids and buns. They obviously did not read those articles. The four women are clustered around this wooden keg that has a metal band at the top and a tap at the bottom. And I can see, even in that grainy photograph, that tap is dripping the same foamy brown liquid that is in the glass my grandmother is handing one of her friends. One of the women is polishing off her glass of dark beer. Another woman is using her glass to toast the unseen photographer, who is maybe my grandfather, maybe Uncle Peter, maybe Uncle Johnny. The men were at that same outing that day. There's another picture that shows them in their suspenders and straw boater hats lounging on the grass. I can promise you this, not one of those guys looks the least bit thirsty. I like to think that sometime later that day, somebody pulled out an accordion and somebody started singing the old songs. And then much, much later, they all laughed and joked as arm in arm, they rolled the empty keg home. So they made it. They made it through the medical examination and the arithmetic quiz. And there was a picnic on the other side. Not every day, but every now and then, a pretty sunny day to share with friends who remembered the words to the old songs. My grandfather worked at Reading Hardware, pouring hot liquid metal into molds to make locks and bolts. It was hot and dangerous work. If you slipped and spilled some of that hot liquid metal and yourself got burned, well, there was no sick leave, no medical insurance, no OSHA regulations. If you got burned and didn't show up for work, hey, you didn't get paid. So you were careful. By 1923, my grandfather had been in this country 11 years. He was almost 30. He and Fila had married, had started a family. They moved into a little house in a neighborhood that everybody called the United Nations, because every house had a different nationality in it. My mother remembered growing up in that neighborhood. She remembered playing stickball on the street, where first base was the fire hydrant, second base was the stop sign, third base was Mrs. Konopolsky's lilac bush. And if the ball happened to roll down the storm sewer, you'd grab the skinniest kid, hold him by the ankles, and lower him down to get the ball. To make a little extra money, my grandmother turned the front room of their house into a store. It would be like a Well, like a convenience store would be today. They sold candy and canned goods and coffee, not milk, not milk. The local dairy still delivered door to door. And not eggs much, even in town. Most people had their own chickens. But they sold tobacco and lunch meat and bread and ice cream, 3 flavors of ice cream and blocks of ice from a big wooden case there in the back of the room. There were similar stores like that all through the neighborhood, 4 stores like that in a 5-block square. But people liked the cheerful Fila. The store did a good business. Fila let people buy on credit. She kept groceries on a lot of tables in 32 and 33. She would tuck an extra cookie into the sack. She could slice the lunch meat extra thin, made half a pound of bologna seem like more. And on Friday afternoons, when the men came home from work with their pay envelopes stuffed with cash, they didn't get paid by check, they got paid in cash. And the women would come in and pay down on their bills. Grandmother would give them a grab bag of candy. 10 pieces of penny candy from all the different containers. And it was good candy, too, because grandmother liked candy, and she got the good stuff. Bone Eagle brand. My mother remembered the Bone Eagle brand salesman. She told me, oh, he had a nice case. It was like a suitcase, and he'd put it on a table and open it. There were little shelves inside to display what he had. And if you were a kid in the store, when the Bone Eagle man came, he gave you samples. Penny candy sparkled in glass containers on top of the counter. Kids would come in and say, how much can I get for a penny? 2 for a penny, 3 for a penny. That was the best. Mary Jane's, Red Hot Dollars, red and black licorice, oh boy chewing gum. That was only 1 for a penny, but it was a long stick. It seemed like a lot. That's what the kids bought with their sticky brown pennies. But the grown-ups, the women, bought lady fingers. Rich chocolate wrapped in silver paper, 4 cents a piece. The store was fragrant with wonderful smells, homemade pickles, homemade sauerkraut, fresh coffee, fresh bread. Everything was fresh. Nothing stayed around too long, not even the canned goods that had to be reached down from a high shelf with one of those long poles with the gripping hand at the end. And you didn't stop and put on a little plastic glove every time you touched something. No, your hand went in the pickle barrel, the cookie jar, the potato bin. It was part of the flavor. Stewed prunes, homemade sauerkraut, castor oil every spring kept your system in good working order. You were tough. You weren't afraid of a little dirt. The store also did a good business in something called the numbers. It was a lottery. It was illegal. Everybody knew about it. Everybody did it. You could play the lottery 6 days a week. The police turned a blind eye, but God might not, so not on Sundays. But Monday to Saturday, you could pay a nickel, pick 3 numbers. At the end of the week, if your number came up, you could win as much as $7. A lot of money in 1933. My mother remembered that in 1933, she was 12 years old. She had nice handwriting, and she was good at math. And so it was her job to keep up with the numbers. And before I go any further and tell you about that, I'm going to give you this. I haven't even touched it. So can you help me? Thank you. Thank you. There you go. So my mother would come right to the store after school, and she would get that big wooden cigar box. You remember the wooden cigar boxes they had then? That's where my grandmother all day long had thrown in the nickels and dimes and scraps of paper saying who had bet what numbers. And then my mother would write it all out nicely on long sheets of paper. And at 4:30, Big Joe would come to collect the money, balance up the numbers. When I asked my mother about Big Joe, she says, oh, he was scary. He said he was 6 feet, 2 inches tall, and he had a glass eye, so that one eye bulged out one way and one eye bulged out the other way. You never knew where he was looking. And every afternoon, Big Joe and the little 12-year-old girl would bend their heads over that cigar box, match it up with the list. My mother says she didn't know why he bothered to check. No one would dream of trying to cheat Big Joe, certainly not her. But she also admitted that even though she was terrified of Big Joe knew that the store did a lot of business for him, and he took care of his own. They never had any trouble. In fact, they only ever were robbed one time, my mother told me. It was a February afternoon Late in the day, a boy came in, maybe 8, 9 years old, shabbily dressed. My mother was waiting on a customer. My grandmother was cleaning the meat slicer. When they looked back up again, the boy was gone, and so were 5 donuts from the tray left on the counter from that morning's delivery. My mother remembered that my grandmother just shrugged. He was probably hungry, is all she said. Oh, the only other trouble they ever had was Mrs. Pavnitsky. She lived there in the neighborhood. She would come in and poke her thumb in the fresh round loaves of bread to deflate them when no one was looking. The store was in business from 1923 to 1937. In those 14 years, life went on in the house behind the store. 7 children born, 6 raised. They lost 1, Eddie, at age 7 to diphtheria. A lot of children died of diphtheria then. And my mother remembered that winter when Eddie was so sick, my grandmother would keep him wrapped up in blankets on a cot there in the kitchen, the one room in the house that was always warm. And to keep the other children away from their contagious brother, she would send them up to the attic, tell them, go up to the attic, get as close to heaven as you can get, and pray for your brother. And they did pray for their brother. But that winter, little Eddie got closer to heaven than any of the rest of them would get for a very long time. Well, by 1937, the Depression was easing up a little bit. Big national grocery store chains were moving into town. People could buy things at the A&P or the Acme cheaper than my grandmother could get them wholesale. So the store shut down. And with most of the children gone and grown, my grandparents moved into a little nicer house, a little nicer neighborhood. And once again, my grandmother had time to spend in her garden. There would always be tomatoes and bell peppers along the back fence, but mostly she grew flowers, anything colorful and pretty. Oh, she could make anything grow. She could take a cutting from Mrs. Konopolsky's lilac bush or a slip from Aunt Anna's climbing rose. She would take those stems, stick them in the dirt, work the ground around it with coffee grounds, take a mason jar, turn it over them to give it its own little private greenhouse, talk to it. Kopaj głęboko, sięgaj do światła, połóż nowe korzenie, dojrzewaj. Dig down deep, lean into the light, put down new roots, grow. And pretty soon, those little cuttings would be putting down new roots. There's even the legend in our family about the first Easter my parents were married. My dad got my mother a corsage to wear to church on Easter Sunday morning, a corsage of yellow tea roses, tiny yellow petals edged in apricot, caught up with a bright yellow ribbon. And after church, they went to my grandmother's house to have the traditional Easter meal. And then when they were getting ready to leave, my mother took off the corsage and gave it to my grandmother. And the next day, my grandmother planted it. Pulled off the yellow ribbon, stuck those stems in the dirt, topped it with its glass Easter bonnet, talked to it. And by the end of that summer, and for summers ever after, there were tiny yellow roses growing in my grandmother's garden. My mother said it's just that grandmother had a green thumb. I think it was something else. I think she just understood something about being transplanted, about being uprooted and stuck down in some strange new place where you were going to have to figure out how to grow in a whole different way. It happens to all of us. We all get transplanted, uprooted at some point in our lives. Sometimes it's voluntary. We move to a new city, a new house, a new job. We follow our heart or a hope or an idea of something better and new. Sometimes it's not voluntary. Hurricanes, tornadoes, pandemics, job demands, family responsibilities pick us up and send us off to some place where we never thought we would be. Sometimes it's not even geographic. Everything around us is exactly the way it's always been, but suddenly something's changed. And we're not sure we know how things work or where we are or even if we're speaking the same language as everybody else. I know it's happened to you. And I don't know what you do when it does happen to you, but I know for me, when it happens to me, and it does, all I know to do is go to the top shelf of my living room bookcase and get this. and think about the words that my grandmother said to encourage her Roses, her children, her friends, her neighbors, the words she would say to you or to me or to anybody who feels uprooted, transplanted. Kopaj głęboko, sięgaj do światła, połóż nowe korzenie, dojrzewaj. Dig down deep, lean into the light, put down new roots, and grow. Well, that was the first pilgrimage to Ellis Island. The second pilgrimage took place, well, it started on a Friday afternoon in mid-November several years ago. I was driving a rental car up Interstate 695, leaving Baltimore Washington International Airport and driving up to Reading, Pennsylvania, my old hometown. It was a quick trip. I was going up one day, coming back the next day. And I had told friends in Birmingham that I was going back to Reading for a big number high school reunion, and that was true. But there were two other reasons why I was making the trip. Two more important reasons I was making the trip. So I got up there that Friday afternoon, went to the high school reunion. That's another story. Some of you have heard that story. And then the next morning, before heading back to the airport, I set out on one of the other two reasons I'd made the trip. My pilgrimage to sacred places. I didn't get back to Reading all that often, and every time I did go back, it seemed like the city was a little bit different. Have you experienced this? You go back someplace that you thought was so familiar, it's way changed. And so there were certain places that I wanted to see one more time before they disappeared entirely. And so, got in my car. First stop in my pilgrimage to sacred places was my elementary school building. Oh, closed for decades now. Tall weeds growing up out of the corners of the red brick building. But if I closed my eyes, I could hear the ring of the school bell on a chilly Pennsylvania morning. I could hear that thump, 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 thump sound of the fourth grade girl standing on the back steps, clapping those erasers to clean them. Her dark green dress covered in a thin veil of white chalk dust. I got up on tiptoe, tried to wipe away some of the dust from a side window, looked inside at the long, narrow room that had been our auditorium, the place where every spring our music teacher, Miss Benetham, would round up the usual suspects for the annual elementary school music recital. The elementary school was 1st through 8th grade, not just 1st through 6th. And every year, Miss Benetham would feature her 1st through 8th grade piano students blundering their way through the John Thompson series of piano for young players. Then there would be Mary O'Reilly dancing her way across the stage. Mary was the only girl at our school who took real dance lessons at a real dance studio. Gift Sisters School of Dance, tap, ballet, and personality. And every spring, Miss Benetham would set aside a solo slot to feature Mary and her dancing. Some years tap, some years ballet. I don't ever remember it being personality. But I do remember I would watch Mary's dance solos from the wings, where I would be waiting with the other 10 members of the elementary school orchestra, waiting for our chance to go out and dazzle the audience. I was in the brass section, which was Billy Campbell and Tommy Boyle on trumpet and me on slide trombone. Then there was the woodwinds. That was Barbara Rodenauser and Joanna Mariani on clarinet, and there was one saxophone played by Eugene Polishak. He'd been held back so many times he had a mustache in 5th grade. The rest of the ensemble was preteen boys on percussion. We pretty much sounded like a family of grizzly bears with saucepan lids. And you can appreciate what Miss Benetham meant when she would admonish us to be grateful for the sacrifices your parents are making to give you music lessons. Not the cost of the lessons or the instrument rentals, but having to sit through those recitals. No extraneous noises, children! Miss Benetham would hiss at us backstage, but we were capable of producing nothing but extraneous noises. Then there was the year David Mandoletti, sixth grade piano student, got things off to a rousing start with a lively rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner, a noble effort that had the audience on its feet a full 5 minutes. Not in a standing ovation, but because David Mandoletti could not remember the final chord. Couldn't remember how to end the national anthem. And so there we all stood, patriotically resolute, but musically unresolved, until Miss Benetham rushed the stage, swept David Mandoletti from the piano bench, leaned over, and played the final chord, allowing everyone to sit down and relax. Just 2.5 more hours of elementary school music recital and a tap dance solo left to go. But of course, that November Saturday morning, the stage lights were dark. The velvet curtain kind of drooped its way across the stage. Frankly, I was surprised the building was still there. Second stop on the pilgrimage was my old high school building. Oh, closed now, but replaced with this beautiful new modern high school over on the bypass, leaving behind just this empty limestone building that once was the home of Mr. William H. Loudon, the man who invented the cough drop. You've heard me, many of you have heard me tell this story about how Mr. Loudon invented the cough drop. Loudon's factory employed hundreds of people round the clock there in Reading. There used to be that big billboard as you came into town that said, "We started the Cold War, Loudons." Well, Mr. Loudon died at the age of 90, a multi-millionaire, a fortune. He had made one box of cough drops, one Fifth Avenue bar at a time. But before he died, he sold, well, such a cheap price, he really gave it away. But he sold his 40-room mansion to the Reading School District. And over time, it became Reading Central High School, the place where I went to high school. It was added onto over the years, of course, but the main part of the school was the old Loudon mansion. The front lobby had a black and white marble floor. You can appreciate the marble, Kerger. There was a white marble staircase going from the front lobby, curving its way up to the second floor, which is where the senior homerooms were located, in rooms that used to be bedrooms. There were hand-painted French porcelain doorknobs, leaded glass windows. Our school library was Mr. Loudon's personal library. Mahogany paneling, hardwood floors, French doors opening onto a balcony overlooking what used to be a rose garden. He had up the hill a big carriage house that sometime earlier had been converted into a 3-car garage and then finally got converted into our chemistry lab, which was a great idea, because you could open up those big wide doors and let out all the toxic fumes before we asphyxiated after some unfortunate encounter with a Bunsen burner. But that November Saturday morning, there were no pops and fizzes coming from the chem lab, no penny loafers tip, 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 tapping up and down the white marble stairs. It was just an elegant, empty building. Too expensive to maintain, too beautiful to tear down. I drove past the farmer's market, closed now, where every Saturday morning we would go to get hoop cheese and Lebanon bologna and shoe-fly pies from that young woman with the rosy cheeks and the little white Mennonite cap. I drove past the house where Mrs. Knoll used to live, Mrs. Knoll, from whom I took piano lessons for 7 years, then over to the old neighborhood, parked the car right there in front of 11th and Pike Playground, the big park right across the street from the house where I grew up, a park that had a softball field and tennis courts and a big playground area with swings and seesaws and a merry-go-round and a metal jungle gym where little kids could climb and swing and hang upside down right over a thick concrete slab. They had all kinds of activities for us there at that playground. One of them, the one I really loved was when the Bible story man would come. Thursday afternoons, the Bible story man would come. Little skinny guy, had white shirt, short sleeve shirt, thick black-rimmed glasses. And the grown-ups would organize all of us kids. They'd call us all together. We'd come and we'd go sit on the picnic tables. Not at the picnic tables, on the picnic tables. Butts on the table, feet on the bench. And watch the Bible story man set up his flannel board. An easel, the big piece of cardboard covered in pale blue flannel. Sometimes when he was setting up, the Hershey's milkman would show up. Oh, the Hershey's truck. It was a tan truck with chocolate brown lettering on the side, said Hershey's, and it would roll slowly along the street that ran right through the middle of the playground. You'd run up to the Hershey's man, hand over 4 pennies, and get a half-pint wax-coated carton of chocolate milk. Back to the picnic table, and with our chocolate milk mustaches, we would watch the Bible story man manipulate his action figures. David and Goliath, Abraham and Isaac, Joseph and his brothers, cardboard cutouts backed in pale blue flannel so that they could stick to the flannel board and he could add and subtract Philistines as needed. Then when the story was finished, we would jump off the picnic tables, take our now empty half-pint wax-coated cardboard cartons, fold down the top flap, put them on the ground. You've done this. Come on, do it with me. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, done just right. Those cartons would explode. An artillery barrage. Pop, 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 pop. Appropriate punctuation for the violent Old Testament story we just heard. Of course, that Saturday morning, there were no exploding milk cartons. Nobody hollering, humming in, as they cheered on the Mulberry Street Athletics or the Rising Sun All-Stars there on the softball field. I went up and sat on the top left bleachers there on the third base side. That's where Gary Schlopik always sat. Gary Schlopik. A boy I had such a crush on when I was 15 years old and worked in the concession stand on ball game nights. Oh, we did a really good business at the concession stand on ball game nights. We sold soft drinks and candy bars and hot dogs, not Burke's Best all-beef Franks. They were not grilled, they were boiled so that they would swell up, and then we'd serve them on a warm steamed bun with a little squiggle of yellow mustard down the middle. Gary Schlopik would come up to the counter, slam down a quarter, say, "Just a dog, no mustard." Oh. He was so gorgeous, had light brown hair and those green eyes. Oh, it's a good thing he didn't know I existed. Because if we'd ever gotten together, if we'd ever gotten married, right now my name would be Dolores Hydock. I climb down the bleachers, go out the main gates, cross a street that I have crossed thousands of times. 6 houses in, there's our house, still there, still has a tree in front. The only tree on the block. That's the way we would identify it to people coming to see it for the first time. It's the only tree on the block. Tree is still there. Well, a tree is still there. Smaller tree, lot smaller tree. The house looks smaller too. The sidewalk looks so narrow. How did we ride our bikes and roller skate and play hopscotch on that little narrow sidewalk? How did we all sit on that front porch? My mom, my dad, my sisters, and me. How did we all sit there on a Friday summer evening eating ice cream cones after the weekly grocery store run? And not just a scoop perched on top of a sugar cone. No. My mother would take a teaspoon and pack the Rocky Road or butter pecan all the way down to the bottom of the cone. Then a scoop on top. You take it out to the front porch and you lick the side of the cone and the side of your hand and the side of your arm down to the elbow. Then you bite off the bottom tip and suck the melted ice cream through the tip, and one last chomp and it was gone. How did we do that? How did we all sit there on that tiny porch that barely looks big enough to hold 2 chairs? It was bigger then. Wasn't it bigger then? I don't want to remember it like this. I wanted to see it, but I want to remember it the way I want to remember it. And so I don't stay long. Besides, I know I'm just procrastinating. I know I am just putting off the other thing, the main thing I came here to do. There's one more thing that I need to do, and I want to do it, and I don't want to do it. Back in the car, out Central Avenue, out Kutztown Road, in through the big wrought iron gates. I've been here lots of times before. My mother never did learn to drive, never wanted to learn to drive. And so in later years, whenever my sisters and I would come to visit, she would always ask us to drive her out here so that she could visit my dad's grave. And so I know exactly where the Hydock plot is. Through the gate, straight ahead, first right, round the curve, up the hill, second left, and you're there. So straight ahead, first right, round the curve, up the hill, second left. I'm not there. Did I do that right? Let me go slower. So straight ahead, round, first right, round the curve, up the hill, second. Do I have it backwards? Back to the gate. Straight ahead, first left, round the curve, up the hill, second. That's not it either. I'd visited my dad's grave lots of times, but this was the first time I was visiting my mother's grave too. She had died 2 years earlier in Birmingham, where she had lived the last 3 years of her life. She loved her new life in Birmingham. She came here one time. She came here to see a program here. And we were having a big memorial party for her with pretzels and beer and polka music there in Birmingham as she was winging her way back to Reading to be buried next to my dad. And so I hadn't seen her grave. I hadn't been back to Reading since then. And I want to see it. I need to see it. And I can't find it. There's an office there next to the front gate, but nobody's there. Saturday morning, nobody's there. There's a framed map on the outside wall, shows the location of all the lot numbers. I don't know the lot number. Why would I know the lot number? I'll call my sister in Arizona. She'll know. No answer. Call my sister in Colorado. Straight to voicemail. What if I can't find it? This is the main reason I made this trip. This is the most sacred stop in my pilgrimage of sacred places. This is the real reunion I came back for, the reunion of me with my mother and her memory, and I can't find her. I feel so stupid. I feel desperate. I decide I will call on the one person who can find anything. Saint Anthony. Patron saint of lost things. That letter from the IRS, undeposited check for $400, that one good black leather glove from a pair that cost you $50, you can't find it, St. Anthony can. So back in the car, start driving around, reciting the mantra, good St. Anthony, please come around, something's lost, it can't be found, good St. Anthony, please come around. I drive and I look and I recite and I suddenly hear the words, she's not here. The words are just in my head, but they are as clear as if someone has said them out loud. She's not here. And the truth of that stops me. I pull over, stop the car. And of course, that's when I see it. The gray stone with the familiar 6 letters. I walk over, trace the letters, trace the numbers. Are all filled in now. I sit down on the ground, run my fingers through the grass. I have imagined this moment for 2 years. For 2 years, I have imagined how connected I will feel to her. I just know I will feel her presence. I will feel her blessing. But I don't. If I'm honest, I don't. It's just stone. It's just grass. It's just a pretty view from the side of the hill. And I know that those words in my head are right. She's not here. I sit a little while in the fading November sunshine, then back in the car, back out through the gates. I have one more stop before I head to the airport. I want to go to Weiss's supermarket. I want to get a few jars of Tallarico Red Hot Hoagie spread. It's a spicy red pepper relish that my mother put in everything she made. Soups, casseroles, scrambled eggs, everything except desserts. It makes everything taste better, and you cannot buy it in Alabama. So I get to Weiss's supermarket. I head for the aisle that's labeled jams, jellies, relishes, condiments. And as I turn the corner, head down that aisle, there she is. I see my mother plain as day. She is standing there with her grocery list in her hand, comparing the price of peach preserves with the special over at the A&P. Of course, that's where I would find her. And I realized she had been with me all day long. She had been standing there at the gate of the elementary school, waiting to walk home with my second grade self. She had been making jokes with the rosy-cheeked girl in the white Mennonite cap as she paid for the shoe-fly pie. She had been standing on the front porch of our house watching me be sure I look both ways before crossing that street. She was standing in the kitchen of that house, packing that butter pecan down to the bottom of the cone. And I realized suddenly that when I got back to Birmingham, I would find her there too. And I was right. There she was, sniffing the fragrance of the waxy white gardenia blossoms from the bush next to the back door. She's sitting at the kitchen table, finishing the crossword puzzle in her second cup of coffee. She sneaks up on me when I walk in a room and catch a whiff of Chanel No. 5. She is not where I thought she would be. But she is not lost. She is not gone. And neither is my elementary school music teacher, or the Mennonite girl with the rosy cheeks, or Mr. William H. Luden, or the Bible story man, or Gary Schloppick, or the enormous porch on my childhood home. They are right where you and I and all of us keep the people and places that are sacred to us. They are here. And they're here. And they are in our stories. And as long as we tell those stories and have those stories, those sacred places and people will remain with us, whatever version of them we want to keep. And if they're there in our stories, then even without the help of good St. Anthony, we will always know exactly where to find them.
I'm going home to hug my mother when we leave here. Thank you so much, Miss Dolores. And I don't care how cold it is outside. There's just something about hearing Dolores for an hour. It just warms this whole room up, and it warms your heart. And thank you so much for all that you put into these stories that you bring to us. And it would not be sending everybody off to the month of November and Thanksgiving without you. So thank you again, Miss Dolores. Thank you. Please make sure you stop by the table. She has some things for sale.
I have a sign-up list. If you are not already on my shameless self-promotion email list, I can let you know about things that are coming up. I'd love to have you get an audience anytime. That's it.
Thank you. And just so you know, Miss Dolores has a fantastic following if you're not aware of that. And so please make sure to look at her schedule if you want to hear some more of her great stories. You can follow her around and be a groupie. So thank you so much to the First Bank of Alabama for making this wonderful series possible. We appreciate everybody so much. And Mr. Chris, it is always a joy to look back there and see you sitting there. So please extend our thanks to everybody at the bank, our volunteers that have helped at the table to pass out cookies and be hospitable, And I also want to mention one more person. Has she already slipped out? Has Miss Jane already slipped? Oh, Miss Jane, she slipped out. Miss Jane Henderson was here today. I want you to say hello to her because she joined us again today after being out for a while. Thank you all so much. And one more person in the back of the room, Dr. Shirley Spears. Dr. Spears, would you wave just in case they don't know who you are? I want to thank Dr. Spears for all that she does because she does run the Comer Library Foundation, and the foundation helps along with the bank and along with Coast Valley Medical Center's Hickory Street Cafe that provides the wonderful cookies. They make these series possible. So thank you so much to everybody. And if you came out this past weekend to the Historical Association's pilgrimage, thank you for joining us then. We had a wonderful weekend. We are taking a break now. We'll be back in February, and we'll have a schedule coming in the mail for you. But thank you all so much. Thank you again, Miss Dolores. And we hope that you have a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you again soon.